They told me my snow breaks were ugly, so I took them down. 2 weeks later, a storm rolled off the Montana plains and sealed their fancy little neighborhood shut like somebody had poured concrete across the only road in. And the strangest part was, when my phone finally rang and the woman who had threatened me with fines was suddenly asking me to save them, all I could think was, Mom, I tried to be the boring old guy with a warning, but you insisted on making me the problem. My name is Henry Colton, and I have lived on the north shoulder of Coyote Lantern Ridge for 31 years, which is long enough to know that winter out here does not behave the way people from warmer places think it behaves. It does not drift down politely and make everything pretty for Christmas cards. It comes in sideways, with its elbows out, screaming across open ground like it has somewhere to be, and a personal grudge against anything standing upright. The wind is the real animal out here, not the snow. Snow by itself is just weather. Wind gives it a plan. Wind picks it up, packs it, moves it, and lays it down exactly where the land tells it to. And if you do not understand that, you can have the best plow contract in the county and still end up trapped behind a wall of white as hard as poured cement. That is why I built my first line of snow breaks about 18 years back, after a bad January storm buried the lower access road for 5 days and foresaw Mrs. Harlan to get her heart medicine delivered by a deputy on a snowmobile. They were not pretty. I will give anybody that. Rough cedar slats, steel posts, wire ties, patched in places where the wind had chewed on them. Gray from years of sun and ice. But they worked. That is the thing about useful things. They are not always photogenic. I set those fences along the lip of my pasture, where the ridge starts to roll down toward the valley, not because I liked looking at them, but because that was where the wind needed to be broken. The idea was simple enough that I could explain it to a child. Slow the wind up here, make the snow drop in my pasture, keep it off the road down below. For years, that road served a few ranchers, the power company, and whoever got lost following bad directions. Then developers came in and bought the old Barstow hayfield, and pretty soon there were 38 houses down there with black roofs, white trim, stone mailboxes, and a name carved into a big wooden sign like it was a resort instead of a frost pocket. Willamere Crossing. I remember the first summer after they opened. People would drive up the ridge just to see the view, and most of them were decent enough. They waved. Some asked about the fences. A few even thanked me after their first real storm. Once they realized their entrance stayed cleaner than any road around it. But communities change when the people running them decide that controlling the look of a place is the same as understanding it. The trouble really started when a woman named Marla Voss bought the big corner house with the copper gutters, the one that looked straight up toward my property. She had moved from Scottsdale, according to everyone, and I do not say that like an insult. People can move wherever they want, but there is a difference between moving to a place and listening to it. Marla did not seem interested in listening. She joined the Willamere HOA board before she'd even survived one full winter, and by October she'd become the kind of person who used words like visual harmony while staring at other people's land. I first heard about it from Tommy Baird. This is one of the younger dads down there, a quiet fellow who used to stop by sometimes to buy firewood. He pulled into my drive one afternoon, left his truck running, and looked uncomfortable before he even said hello. That is never a good sign. He leaned on the hood, rubbed his hands together, and said, "Henry, I just wanted to give you a heads up before it turns official." I said, "Before what turns official?" He looked over his shoulder like the HOA might be hiding in the choke trees. "Marla has been bringing up your fences at meetings, says they ruin the sightline from the neighborhood and make the development look neglected." I just stared at him for a second, then laughed, because sometimes laughter is the only thing keeping you from saying something less neighborly. I said, "Tommy, those fences are the reason your road stays open when the wind comes north." He nodded fast, like he already knew, and said, "I told them that." A couple others did too. But she says the board is snow removal covered and the fences are not on approved architectural plans. Approved architectural plans. On my land. I remember that phrase because it landed in my ear like a pebble in a boot. A week later, the letter came. Cream-colored paper. HOA seal at the top. 3 paragraphs of polished nonsense about view obstruction, aesthetic degradation, and adverse impact on community value. At the bottom, in language that was not polished at all, it said I had 14 days to remove the structures, or the board would pursue fines, legal remedies, and recovery of associated costs. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold in the other. and I felt something low and tired settle into my chest. Not rage, not yet, more like disappointment. There is a special kind of stupidity that dresses itself up as authority, and once it starts using letterhead, you know you are in for a long week. Still, I am not the kind of man who looks for a fight just because somebody hands me one. So I went to their meeting. I put on my clean work jacket, brought a folder with county wind maps, photos from past storms, even a couple of old newspaper clippings about road closures in that drawer, and I drove down to their clubhouse, which smelled like new carpet, coffee pods, and people who had never had to thaw a gate latch with their bare hands. They had folding chairs lined up in neat rows, a little table up front, and Marla, sitting in the middle like a judge on a daytime television show. She smiled when I walked in, but it was the kind of smile that does not invite you closer. It keeps you in your place. When they called my name, I stood up and explained it as plainly as I knew how. I told them the fences were not decoration. I told them their entrance road sat in a natural catch basin. I showed them where the wind came over my pasture, where it lost speed, where the snow fell when the brakes were in place, and where that same snow would land if they forced me to remove them. I even said, look, I understand they are not pretty, but neither is a 12-foot drift across your only way out. A few people shifted in their chairs. One older man in the back muttered, makes sense to me. But Marla folded her hands on the table and gave me that patient little smile people use when they are not listening. They are just waiting for you to stop talking. Mr. Colton, she said, we appreciate your passion for rural maintenance, but Willamette Crossing has contracted professional snow services, and our homeowners have a right to enjoy the views they purchased. I looked at her for a long second. Rural maintenance. That was what she called 18 years of keeping her road alive. I said, with respect, your contractor cannot plow snow that has not stopped moving. This is not a landscaping preference. It is physics. Marla tilted her head and said, we will take your comments under advisement. And right then, in that clean little clubhouse, surrounded by people who wanted mountain views without mountain consequences, I knew the decision had already been made. The decision came 3 days later, not in person, not with a phone call, not even with one of those neighborly little conversations people claim they value so much, but through another letter, this one shorter and colder than the first. The board had reviewed my remarks, it said, and determined that the fencing structures remained inconsistent with the visual standards of Willamette Crossing. I had 10 days left to remove them. 10 days. Like the weather cared about their calendar. I stood on my porch reading that letter while the ridge wind moved through the dry grass, and I remember looking down at those houses, all tidy and warm-looking, porch lights blowing against the early dusk, and I felt the last bit of patience leave me. Not in a dramatic way. There was no speech, no slammed door, no vow of revenge. It was quieter than that. It was the moment a man realizes he has explained the stove is hot, watched someone place their hand above the burner, heard them say they know better, and decided not to grab their wrist anymore. So I complied, completely. That Saturday morning, I walked out with a thermos of coffee, a post puller, a pry bar, and a pair of gloves stiff from old winters, and I started taking down 18 years of practical work one section at a time. If you've never taken apart something you built to protect people who do not appreciate it, I cannot really explain the feeling. It is not anger exactly. It is more like grief wearing work boots. Each post came out with a groan from the frozen dirt. Each cedar slat snapped loose with a dry crack. The wire cut into my gloves. The wind slapped my face. And down below I could see those perfect houses staring back at me with their big windows and clean roofs, like an audience that had no idea what show it had bought tickets for. Around noon, my neighbor Silas Reed came by in his old green pickup, the one with a heater that worked only when it felt spiritually ready. Silas was 72, built like a fence post himself, and had lived on that ridge longer than I had. He slowed by my gate, rolled down the window, and looked at the gaps where the first stretch of snow breaks used to be. He did not ask what I was doing. He already knew. He just said, "They finally made you pull them." I said, "They did." He chewed on that for a second, eyes narrowed against the wind, then said, "Well, I hope Willamette bought the deluxe plow package." I laughed despite myself, and he gave me a little salute before driving off. That was Silas. He never used 5 words when 3 could do damage. By Sunday evening, the ridge looks naked. That is the only word for it. Naked and wrong. The line that had broken the wind for nearly 2 decades was gone, and the pasture opened straight down toward the valley. Smooth and exposed, exactly the kind of clean view Marla Voss had wanted. I stacked the last boards in my equipment shed, because I'm not the kind of fool who throws away good lumber, and when I came back out, there she was. Marla had parked her silver SUV at the turnoff below my drive, and was standing beside it in a cream-colored coat that looked expensive enough to have its own insurance policy. She looked up at the ridge, hands tucked into her pockets, and smiled like she had personally improved nature. "Much better," she called. "It really opens the view." I leaned on the gate and looked at the empty pasture, then at her. "Sure does," I said. She seemed to miss the tone, or maybe she heard it and chose to step over it. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Cope." That sentence sat between us like a dead mouse. Cooperation, as if she had asked me to help set up chairs for a picnic, not threatened legal action over safety infrastructure she did not understand. I gave her a small nod and said, "Just following the board's instructions." Her smile tightened for half a second. Then she got back in the SUV and drove down toward Willowmere, her tires crunching over gravel that would soon be under a whole lot more than gravel. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. That is how winter likes to work out here. It lets people feel confident. It gives them blue skies and cold mornings and just enough frost on the mailboxes to make everybody think they are handling it. I went about my business, split wood, checked the propane tank, hauled feed, kept one eye on the forecast, like I always do. Then, on a Thursday morning, the radio started using words that make people like me stop what we're doing. Rapid pressure drop, sustained northern winds, heavy accumulation, ground blizzard conditions. By 10, the sky had turned the color of dirty wool. By noon, the first snow was not falling so much as traveling, thin and sharp, whipping across the pasture in white ropes. I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee and watched it move over the exact spot where the snow breaks used to slow it down. Only now, there was nothing there. No cedar slats, no broken wind, no early drop zone. The snow skinned over my field like smoke over glass and went straight for the dip in the road below. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind had found its rhythm. It came over the ridge in long, violent pushes, the kind that makes the house creak and makes cattle turn their backs without being told. I walked out to the porch for maybe 30 seconds and came back in with ice in my eyebrows. Down at Willowmere's entrance, a drift had started forming across the road. Not huge yet, but shaped exactly the way I'd shown them in those photographs. A smooth white lip at first, then a mound, then a ridge. By 5, it was chest high. By 6:30, it was taller than a man and getting harder every minute because the wind was not just piling snow, it was beating it into place. That is the part people never believe until they meet it with a shovel. Wind-packed snow is not fluffy. It has layers. It has weight. It fights back. Around 7. I saw the first plow come out from inside Willowmere, headlights hazy in the blowing snow, amber light flashing on top like a little warning nobody could hear. It was one of those contractor trucks with a blade on the front, perfectly fine for a parking lot, perfectly useless against a drift that had decided to become architecture. The driver backed up, took a run at it, and hit the snow hard. For 1 second, the blade threw white to both sides, and I thought, well, maybe he will surprise me. Then the truck stopped dead, not slowed, stopped. The front end lifted a little, the tires spun, the engine roared, and the storm just kept feeding snow around it like it was tucking the truck into bed. He tried backing out. He tried rocking it. He tried turning the blade. None of it mattered. By 8, that plow was buried to the doors, hazard lights blinking under a frosting of snow, looking less like equipment and more like evidence. I did not feel joy watching that. I want to be clear about that. There was a small bitter part of me that felt vindicated. Sure, because a man can only be called dramatic so many times before reality showing up feels personal. But mostly I felt tired. I knew there were kids down there. Older folks, people who had not written the letter, had not smiled at my empty ridge, had not used the phrase aesthetic degradation like it meant more than an open road. By midnight, the entrance was gone. I mean gone. From my ridge, where the road should have been, there was only a pale wall curving through the dark, maybe 10 feet high in some places, maybe more, where the land funneled the wind. The lights of Willowmere glowed behind it, soft and trapped, like a little ship frozen in place. The next morning, my phone started ringing before I had finished breakfast. I let the first call go, then the second. When the third came in and Marla Voss's name showed on the screen, I picked up. Her voice had lost all of its clubhouse polish. "Mr. Colton, we have an emergency." I looked out the window at the white wall below. "I figured you might. Our entrance is completely blocked," she said, "and the plow is stuck. We have residents who need to leave immediately." I took a breath, because I could feel my temper moving around inside me. Not hot, but awake. "That is going to be hard." "Hard," she repeated, like I had offended her. "You need to clear it." I almost admired the nerve. Even trapped behind 10 feet of snow, she still knew how to issue an order. I said, "Marla, I do not own that road. I do not run your plow service. And the snow brakes that used to prevent this are stacked in my shed because your board ordered me to remove them." The silence on her end was sharp enough to cut wire. "Then," she said, "then put them back, right now." I looked at the storm still moving sideways past my window and gave a short laugh before I could stop myself. "Right now," I said. "The ground is frozen. The wind is still running close to 50. And putting up fences after the drift has formed is like locking the barn after the horse has joined a rodeo." She did not like that. "This is serious," she snapped. "People are trapped. One man needs dialysis tomorrow. A family has a baby with a fever." That shut me up for a moment. Because there it was. The parlor was not funny. The part no one puts in the satisfying version of the story. Consequences do not land only on the people who earn them. They spread. They roll downhill. "Same as snow," I said. "Call the county emergency office. Tell them the road is blocked by a wind-packed drift and your plow is disabled." She said, "We did." They said, "It may take hours." I looked down at Willamere again, at the little row of roofs disappearing in the storm, and said, "Then I suggest you keep everyone inside and warm." She hung up without saying goodbye. By the second day, the county had to come in with a rotary blower they usually reserve for the pass north of Red Basin. You could hear it before you saw it, a grinding mechanical growl moving through the storm, slow and stubborn. It took them most of the day to chew through that drift. They carved the entrance open one frozen layer at a time, throwing snow high into the air in long white arcs. And when they finally broke through, the road looked like a trench cut through a glacier. Willamere had been trapped for nearly 3 days. The bill, which Silas heard about before sunset because that man collected gossip like firewood, came to just under $21,000. Emergency equipment, overtime, damaged contractor plow, the whole ugly menu, and every penny of it went to the HOA. 2 evenings later, after the wind had finally dropped and the world had gone quiet in that exhausted way it does after a big storm, I heard a knock on my door. Not a letter this time, not a threat. A knock. I opened it, and there stood Marla Voss. No cream coat, no boardroom smile, just red eyes, chapped cheeks, and 2 board members behind her who looked like they would rather be anywhere else on earth. For a second, none of us said anything. The porch light made the snow behind them look blue, and the 3 of them stood there with that stiff, embarrassed posture people get when pride has dragged them all the way to your front door and then left them holding the bag. Marla finally swallowed and said, "Mr. Colton, may we come in?" Now, I could have made her stand out there. I could have leaned on the doorframe and said something sharp, something worthy of the little courtroom she had built in that clubhouse. But I had spent enough years in hard weather to know there was no point making people colder just because they finally understand the stove was hot. So I stepped aside and said, "Come on in." My kitchen was warm, smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the 3 of them looked strangely small sitting at my table, like the storm had taken some air out of them. Marla kept her gloves folded in her lap. Beside her was Brent Holloway, the board treasurer, a man who had once told me at a mailbox gathering that standards protect everyone. And next to him was Lacey Monroe, who had 2 kids down in Willamere and looked like she had not slept since Thursday. I poured coffee because that is what my mother taught me to do. Even when the guests had recently threatened to sue you, nobody touched it at first. Then Lacey wrapped both hands around the mug like it was holding her up. Marla cleared her throat and said, "We owe you an apology." I looked at her, not because I wanted to watch her squirm, but because I needed to know whether she was saying words or understanding them. She continued, "The board made a decision without fully appreciating the function of your snow brakes." Brent stared into his coffee. Lacey said quietly, My youngest had a fever the second night. We could not get out. My husband tried to shuffle, but it was like cutting brick with a spoon. That one landed harder than Marla's apology. It reminded me again that consequences rarely land clean. The people who sign a paper are not always the only people who pay the bill. I nodded and said, "I am sorry a boy went through that." Lacey nodded back. And, for a moment, the room lost its courtroom feeling and became what it should have been from the start. Neighbors sitting at a table, talking about a road, a storm, and how to keep people safe. Then Marla said the sentence I'd known was coming. "We would like you to reinstall the snow brakes." There it was, simple as a grocery list. As if 18 years of work had not been pulled out of frozen ground because she wanted an open view from her upstairs windows. I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of coffee, and let the quiet stretch just long enough for everybody to feel it. Then I said, "I am willing to rebuild them, but not the way it was before." Marla's shoulders tightened. What does that mean? It means those fences are not decorations, and they are not personal clutter, and they are not something your board gets to vote on every time somebody new decides they are ugly. They are safety infrastructure. If they go back up, they stay up. Brent finally looked at me. "You want a written agreement?" I said, "I want more than a handshake and a nicer letter. I want a recorded easement or agreement, reviewed by lawyers, naming those snowbreaks as permanent winter safety structures tied to road access. No future aesthetic complaints, no fines, no removal demands, no view corridor language. If Wilhelmina wants the protection, Wilhelmina recognizes what it is." Marla's mouth pressed into a line. I could see her fighting the instinct to negotiate just for the sake of keeping power in the room. Then I added, "And I'm not rebuilding them for free." That got all three of them looking at me. I said, "The first time, I built them because the road needed it and because out here people used to understand that keeping a road open helped everybody. This time, your board turned my work into a legal dispute, ordered it removed, created an emergency, and stuck your residents with a $21,000 lesson. So if you want it done right, you hire me as a consultant. You pay for materials, labor, maintenance, and inspections before major winter weather." Brent nodded almost immediately, because treasurers understand numbers faster than pride. Lacey looked relieved. Marla looked like someone had handed her a bowl of nails and called it breakfast. But after a long moment, she said, "That is reasonable." I almost smiled. Reasonable had taken 3 days of isolation and 1 buried plow to arrive, but better late than frozen. The paperwork took 9 days. Lawyers cleaned up the language. The county road office added a note about emergency access, and Wilhelmina's insurance company, which I suspect had spoken very firmly to the board, made sure nobody could pretend the issue was cosmetic again. When the final agreement was signed, I walked out to my shed, pulled the cedar slats back into daylight, and for the first time since taking them down, I felt something ease in my chest. Rebuilding them was not glamorous. It was cold, muddy work, with my shoulders aching and the wind nosing around my collar like an old dog looking for weakness. But every post that went into the ground felt different this time. Before, those fences had just been practical. Now they were proof. Proof that experience matters. Proof that land has rules, whether people write them down or not. Proof that sometimes the ugliest thing in the view is the thing quietly keeping everyone safe. Silas came by on the second afternoon. Same old green pickup. Same window that screamed halfway down. He looked at the fresh line of posts stretching along the ridge and said, "Well, I guess Wilhelmina finally upgraded from pretty to useful." I laughed and said, "Cost them enough." He nodded toward the valley. But he usually does. By the next storm, the snow brakes were fully back in place, stronger than before, set a little wider, braced better, with a maintenance schedule and everything, which still makes me chuckle. The first real wind came just after sunset. I stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the snow sweep over the pasture, hit those cedar slats, slow down, and fall exactly where it was supposed to fall. Piles built along my field, white and heavy and harmless, while the road below stayed open, dark and passable. Down in Wilhelmina, porch lights glowed warm behind clean driveways, and I wondered how many of those people knew the road was open because of something they had once been told was an eyesore. Marla resigned from the board before spring. Somebody said she moved back south, though I never cared enough to confirm it. Brent sent me a holiday card that year, which was awkward, but not unwelcome. Lacey still waves when she drives by, and once she brought up a tin of cookies with her boys, who wanted to sing to famous fences. Famous fences. Imagine that. A bunch of weather boards and wire becoming a local legend because adults had to learn that winter does not care about curb appeal. I still think about it sometimes, especially when the wind starts hitting the house hard enough to make the rafters talk. Was I wrong to stop fighting after that meeting? I warned them. I showed them maps, photos, history, everything I had. They chose not to listen, and I chose to comply. Part of me says that was fair. Another part of me remembers Lacey's boy with the fever and wonders whether being right is ever as clean as it feels in the moment. Maybe that is the real lesson. Not that Marla was wrong, though she was. Not that I was right, though I was. The lesson is that power without humility can turn a neighborhood into a trap, and common sense ignored long enough will always come back as a bill somebody has to pay. So tell me honestly, if you had been in my boots, what would you have done? Would you have kept arguing with people who had already made up their minds? Would you have refused to take the snowbreaks down and fought them in court? Or would you have done what I did? Follow their order to the letter and let winter explain the rest? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I really do want to know where you draw that line between responsibility and consequences. And if this story made you think about the strange little wars people fight over rules, pride, land, and common sense, share it with someone who has dealt with an HOA, a bad board, or a neighbor who cared more about appearances than reality, and subscribe for more stories where the truth does not always arrive politely. It always arrives.